In the village of Milbrook, everyone knew the Iron Beast. On the northern marches, the wounds of war don't close, they rot. Skara was chained inside a cage of raw iron at the center of the square, displayed like a hunting trophy. The sheriff charged 5 coppers for anyone who wanted to spit and 10 silvers for anyone who wanted to touch her. Nobody cared. Nobody, except a man who carried the smell of coal and the weight of too many graves in his eyes. Bram, the blacksmith, dropped his forge bellows and walked to the cage with a pouch of coins worth a life and an axe that knew no forgiveness. The village of Milbrook smelled of mud and old hatred, the kind of smell that settles into wood and wool and never quite leaves. It rose from the market stalls, from the boots of farmers tracking manure across stone paths, from the dark corners of the tavern where men drank too much and said things they almost meant. But the worst smell came from the center of the square, where a cage of raw iron sat on a wooden platform, its bars streaked orange with rust from the constant rain of the northern marches. Inside the cage was a woman. She sat on a rotting plank, shoulders curved under the weight of chains. Her skin was deep green, the color of river moss after a storm, and her dark hair hung in tangled ropes around her face. Her ears came to sharp points. 2 small pale fangs pressed against her lower lip. She was an orc, and the people of Milbrook had decided that was reason enough for everything they were doing to her. Children climbed onto their fathers' shoulders to stare at her teeth. Women whispered curses behind shawls of worn wool. Boys at the edge of the crowd bent down to pick up stones. Her name was Skara. The village called her the Iron Beast. Bram heard the name from across the square. He had just come from the forge, his leather apron still warm from the coals, his hands rough with soot and old calluses. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with burn scars climbing his left forearm like the marks of a vine. He had been walking toward the flour merchant's stall, a squat, careful man named Aldrich, who always counted his coins twice and his words once. When the crowd thickened and the shouting began, he stopped at the edge of the square and looked. He had seen cages before. He had seen men put in them too during the wars on the Iron Frontier, when both sides stopped believing that the other side was made of people. He had spent 3 years trying to forget the things that came with that belief. He stood very still and watched Skara. She did not react to the stones. She did not flinch when a clod of wet dirt hit the bar beside her head. She only sat, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the village, beyond the grey sky. She had gone somewhere inside herself where none of this could reach her. Bram had done the same thing once. After the fever took his wife, after it took his son 4 days later, after he had stood in the churchyard in winter and listened to the priest say words that meant nothing and felt the cold go all the way through him until it settled somewhere behind his ribs and stopped moving. He recognized the look. At the edge of his vision, something caught his attention. On the platform beside the cage, the sheriff had nailed a wooden sign. Bram squinted through the drizzle to read it. A chill moved through him that had nothing to do with the rain. He turned away from the sign. He looked at his boots. He looked at Aldrich's stall, still waiting for him. Then he looked back at the cage. Something he could not name pulled at him, quiet as a fishhook, steady as iron. The square was loud around him, but for just a moment the noise fell away, and there was only the woman in the cage and the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something he could not take back. He took a slow breath. He walked forward. Sheriff Vagger was a wide man with a smile like a split in old leather. He stood beside the cage collecting coins in a tin cup, calling out to passers-by with the ease of a man who had never once doubted his own goodness. He wore a silver badge on his chest and a pistol on each hip, and he spoke as though every word he said was already law. 1 copper to look, 10 silvers to touch, he called. Come see the Iron Beast. Come see what crawled out of the thornwood and thought it had a right to our land. Bram reached the edge of the platform and stopped. Up close, the cage smelled of iron and damp straw and something sharp and wild beneath it. like pine sap and smoke. He looked at Skara through the bars. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on that same invisible point. He could see now the scars across her knuckles, the bruise along her jaw, the way her wrists had been rubbed raw by the shackles. She had been here long enough to start bleeding where the iron met her skin. Nobody had done anything about that. Bram cleared his throat. Vagar turned and looked him over with flat eyes. Bram, didn't figure you for the entertainment type. What's the price to take her? Bram said. The words came out flat. He had not planned them, but once they were in the air, he did not take them back. Vagar blinked. Then he laughed, a big wet sound that made two nearby farmers turn to look. Take her? For labor? She's orc, Bram, not a draft horse, though I wouldn't blame you for the confusion. Not for labor, Bram said, for good. The square did not go quiet, exactly, but a particular kind of attention shifted through the crowd, the way it does when something unexpected happens and people start deciding how they feel about it. Vagar's smile changed. The easy part of it went away. What was left was harder and meaner. That's an interesting thing to say out loud. Nah, you've got a price on the sign, Bram said. He looked at it. Says 500 silvers buys the sheriff's right to release a prisoner into the custody of a Milbrook citizen. That's an old law for human prisoners. Says prisoner, Bram said. Doesn't specify. A silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Bram reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He set it on the edge of the platform. It was heavy. It landed with the sound of real money. Count it, he said. Vagar stared at the pouch. Something moved behind his eyes, fast and greedy. He reached for the cup on his belt and began to count. Skara had not moved, but Bram noticed, when he glanced at her, that her eyes had shifted. She was looking at him now, not at the invisible horizon. At him. Her gaze was level and cold and careful, the way a person looks when they have learned not to hope for anything and are trying to figure out what trick this is. Bram met her eyes. He did not look away. He wanted her to see that there was no trick. He was not sure it was enough, but it was all he had. Vagar finished counting. He did not look happy. He looked like a man who had gotten what he wanted and was furious about it. Fine, he said. He pulled a key from his belt and slapped it into Bram's hand. She's your problem now. He said it low, almost to himself. Skara, and heard her answer, low and quiet, before he even turned the key. The key was cold and small and surprisingly light for what it meant. Bram closed his fingers around it and stood there for a breath, letting the noise of the square settle back into the distance. He was still on the platform. The crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown thicker, people drawn by the stillness of the moment, the way they are drawn by the stillness before a storm. He stepped up to the cage door and fit the key into the lock. Before he could turn it, boots hit the platform behind him. Bram! The voice was low and flat and carried a specific kind of weight, the kind built from years of giving orders to men who stopped questioning them. Bram turned. The man who had spoken was tall and lean, dressed in a dark coat with silver buttons. A scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His eyes were pale, almost grey, and they had the stillness of water over deep rock. His name was Draven. Bram knew him the way everyone on the frontier knew him, by reputation, by the stories that travelled from town to town like bad weather. That orc, Draven said, killed my brother. The square was very quiet now. On the northern marches, Draven continued, 2 years ago he was unarmed. From inside the cage, Skara spoke. Her voice was low and steady. Your brother and 2 of his friends cornered me in the Thornwood 4 days after my companion was killed in battle. They were not unarmed, and they were not what you would call gentle. She said it without heat. She said it the way someone states the direction of wind. Draven's jaw tightened. You expect me to believe? I expect nothing from you, Skara said. I am telling you what happened. You can do with it what you choose. Draven looked at Bram. Walk away. She's not worth it. Already paid, Bram said. He turned back to the lock and turned the key. The mechanism released with a clean, dry sound. The door swung open. Bram stood and stepped aside, offering the space without touching her. Skara rose slowly. She unfolded herself from the crouch she had been holding and stood to her full height. She was nearly as tall as Bram, broader through the shoulders than most men in the square. She moved carefully, like someone testing whether their body still works after a long time of not being allowed to. She stepped out of the cage. The crowd moved back further. Bram did not move back. He extended his hand, palm up, empty. A gesture of offered steadiness, nothing more. Skara looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she placed her palm against his. Her grip was firm. Her palm was rougher than his. Behind them, Draven said nothing. But his eyes, when Bram glanced back once, promised something that had not yet been spoken. The two of them walked through the square together, past the tavern called the Scarred Keg, past Aldrich's flower stall, past the crowd that parted and watched and muttered. The empty cage sat open on the platform behind them. Ahead, the road curved toward the Tescan River. The trees of Thornwood rose dark and tall on the far bank. The wind came off the water with the smell of pine and cold iron, and something Skara breathed in slowly, something that felt distantly like relief. Bram's cottage sat close to the Tescan, half hidden by a stand of ash trees with bark the colour of old bone. The building was made of river stone and oak beams, small and low and solid, the kind of structure built by someone who intended to stay. A covered forge stood attached to one side, open on 3 walls, with an anvil darkened by years of use and a rack of tools hung in careful order. Among them, on a pair of iron hooks beside the forge door, hung a broad-headed axe, with a handle worn smooth from use, the one tool Bram had carried back from the frontier wars and never quite managed to put away for good. Skara said nothing on the walk from the village. Bram said nothing either. The rain had thinned to a cold mist, and their boots made soft sounds on the mud path. Inside, the cottage smelled of wood smoke and turnip stew and iron filings. A fire burned low in the hearth. There was one cot, a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf of tools and dried herbs above the window. Bram pointed to the cot. "That's yours. I sleep in the forge." Skara looked at the cot, then at him. Why? It was a simple question, but it carried many questions inside it. He pulled off his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. "When I was on the frontier, my unit sheltered in an orc village for a winter. We were cold and half-starved. They fed us, didn't ask for much back, just asked that we not touch their things and not lie to them." He picked up a poker and moved the coals in the hearth. "Seemed reasonable then. Seems reasonable now." He ladled 2 bowls of stew from the pot on the fire and set one on the table for her. Skara sat. She wrapped her hands around the bowl and held it without eating for a moment, letting the warmth move through her palms where the shackle marks were still raw. Then she ate, slowly, with the focused attention of someone who has not had a proper meal in too long. Bram sat across from her and ate his own bowl. After a while she said, "What do you want from this?" "Work, if you're willing," he said. "The forge takes 2 sets of hands on the hard jobs. I'll teach you the trade if you want to learn it. In return, I give you the cot and a share of whatever I earn. You leave when you want." He looked at her. "No debt, no service beyond what you freely offer." Skara set her spoon down and looked at the fire. "You paid 500 silvers, she said. "I did. That's not nothing." "No," he agreed, "it's not. And you want nothing back." He considered that. "I want the forge to keep running. I want this valley to stop smelling like cruelty every time I walk into the village. Those aren't things you owe me. They're just things I want." He picked up his spoon. "Eat your stew." She looked at him for a long moment. He had the sense that she was measuring something, not him exactly, but the space between what he said and what he meant, looking for the gap. She was looking hard and finding it smaller than she expected. She picked up her spoon. Outside, the river moved past the ash trees in the dark. Somewhere in the thornwood, an owl called once and went silent. Skara reached up and unpinned a small object from the inside of her collar. She set it on the table between them. It was a crystal, dark purple, roughly the size of a walnut, threaded on a cord of braided leather. "My clan's lineage crystal," she said. "The only thing of theirs I have left." She did not explain further. She tucked it back into her collar, finished her stew, and said nothing more. But when she lay down on the cot that night and the fire burned low, Bram, settling onto his bedroll in the forge, heard the silence from the cottage change. It became very slightly, less like the silence of someone waiting to be hurt. Winter settled over the Tescan Valley like a held breath. The days fell into a rhythm. Bram rose before light and had the forge fire built by the time grey came into the sky. Skara woke shortly after, fed the coals their morning measure of wood, and began the hauling work that filled the early hours. Carts of ore from the storage shed, baskets of scrap iron sorted by grade, the heavy grinding wheel that needed to be repositioned every few days as the work shifted. She was stronger than Bram had expected. Not in a surprising way, but in the way of someone who had spent years using their body for exactly what a body is made to do. She moved with economy, without wasted effort. When she lifted cleanly. When she carried, she did not complain about the weight. He began teaching her the forge work in the second week. She learned the way a person learns who has paid careful attention to the world their whole life. He showed her how to read the color of heated iron, how pale yellow meant too hot and dull orange meant move faster. She made mistakes and noted them without frustration. She asked questions that were precise and few. By the third week, she was drawing wire and shaping nail stock without supervision. In the evenings they ate and talked or did not talk in equal measure. Bram told her about the iron frontier, the winters that froze the rivers solid, the battles that left more questions than answers. She told him about her clan, the Gara Jade, who had moved with the seasons through the high passes, and about the rituals of the long bone fires they built in winter to honor the dead. "We burn the names," she said one evening. "Write them on strips of bark and feed them to the fire at midnight, so the dead know they're not forgotten." "Does it work?" he asked. She considered. "Something happens at midnight around the fire. Whether it's the dead hearing or the living remembering, I'm not sure it matters." He thought about that. He thought about his wife and his son and the churchyard in winter and the priest who had meant well and said nothing useful. "I have 2 names I've been carrying," he said. "Maybe we do that." She looked at him without surprise, as if she'd been waiting for him to arrive at this. "When you're ready," she said. "The fire will keep." That night, Bram woke from a dream that came back sometimes, the sound of his son coughing, thin and persistent, in the dark of a winter house. He lay still and listened to the forge, to the pop of cooling metal and the wind off the Tescan, until his breathing steadied. From the cottage, no sound, but a thin line of firelight showed under the door. She was awake too, and she had kept the hearth lit. He did not know why that mattered. But it did. The trouble came on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong somehow. Trouble on the frontier usually arrived with weather, with storms or cold snaps, or the kind of fog that erased the tree line. But that Tuesday was clear and pale, with frost on the ground and the sound of the river loud in the cold air. Bram heard the horses first, 4 of them, from the sound. He set down his hammer and came out of the forge. Draven was there. He had 3 men with him, each one wearing the blank look of people who are paid not to have opinions. They sat on horses at the edge of the ash trees and looked at the cottage with the patient calm of men who believe time is on their side. Draven's pale eyes found Bram immediately. "I've been reasonable," he said. "I gave you time to think." "I didn't need time," Bram said. "The orc is property of the village until the warrant is cleared. The sheriff's sale was informal. There are courts in Heartwall that would agree with me." Bram heard the cottage door open behind him. He did not turn around. "There are courts in Heartwall that agree with whoever pays them the most," Bram said. "That's not law, that's commerce." Draven looked past him. "The lineage crystal. I know she has it. It's a piece of Garra Jade clan property, which makes it a war trophy under the Frontier Settlement Act. The sheriff should have inventoried it when she was taken." He said it carefully, like a man who has rehearsed the words. "I want the crystal and the orc released to Frontier jurisdiction." From behind Bram, Skara said, "The crystal was my mother's. She gave it to me the morning she died. Clan property passes to blood, not to conquerors." "Under orc law," Draven said. "Under every law that matters," she said. One of Draven's men shifted his hand toward his belt. The movement was small and slow, like a man reaching for something he thought no one would notice. Bram's hand moved first. He reached for his forge hammer, which was leaning against the doorframe, and picked it up and held it loosely at his side. "Bread and roof law in this valley means the person I shelter is my responsibility and my protection," Bram said. "You know that law. It's older than the sheriffs and older than the settlement acts. You touch her on my land, and you've broken it." The man who had reached for his belt stopped reaching. Draven looked at Bram for a long time. He looked at the hammer. He looked at Skara behind him, and whatever he saw in her face. Then he turned his horse around. His men followed. "This isn't done," he said without looking back. "No," Bram agreed quietly. "It isn't." The sound of the horses faded into the trees. The frost glittered on the ground around the ash trees. Somewhere in the thornwood something moved. Bram lowered the hammer. "They'll come back at night," Skara said. It was not a question. "Probably," he said. "Then we should prepare." He nodded. They went back inside, and the door closed behind them. They prepared the way people prepare, who have both seen what violence looks like from the inside and would prefer not to see it again, but are clear-eyed enough to understand that preferring something is not the same as preventing it. Bram reinforced the cottage shutters. He laid iron bars across the window frames on brackets he had made years ago and never expected to use. He took the axe down from its hooks beside the forge door and leaned it against the wall where his hand could find it in the dark. Skara took the work seriously and added to it in ways he had not considered. She cut dry brush and stacked it along the south fence line where the tree cover was thinnest, so that anyone approaching from that direction would make noise. She scraped the mud from the path near the forge entrance and replaced it with loose gravel. She said nothing about where she had learned this. Bram did not ask. In the late afternoon, she did something that surprised him. She took the lineage crystal from its cord and carried it out to the spot behind the cottage, where a flat river stone sat embedded in the soil. She set the crystal on the stone and spent several minutes there, eyes closed, speaking words he could not hear and did not try to. When she came back, her expression was cleaner somehow, steadier. "Asking your clan," he said. "Asking my mother," she said. "She always had better strategic sense than me." He said nothing, but something in his chest moved unexpectedly. That night they did not sleep. Draven's men came at the 3rd hour after midnight. They came on foot without lanterns, the 4 of them moving through the frost in silence. They had left the horses somewhere back in the trees. They moved carefully, the way men do when they have done this before and believe that patience is the same thing as skill. But Skara had been right about the brush, and the brush was right about them. The fight was fast and ugly, and happened mostly in the dark. Bram took a cut across the shoulder that stung badly and would require stitching later. Skara moved through the chaos with a ferocity that was not wild, but deliberate, her body doing exactly what she asked of it, no more and no less. Draven came last, from the direction of the river. He had his silver dagger drawn. Bram caught the first swing on the head of the forge axe he had taken down from the wall. The impact rang up his arms. Skara caught Draven's wrist before he could recover and twisted, not enough to break, just enough to make him understand that she could. Draven went still. "The crystal," Skara said, "stays with me. The warrant you can take back to Heartwall and do what you want with it, but you do not come to this valley again." Draven breathed hard and looked at her with eyes full of something that was not quite hatred and not quite grief. The kind of emotion that does not have a clean name. "You could have just let him die," he said. "My brother." "Yes," she said. "I chose not to. He's alive. You know where he is." A pause. Something shifted in his face. She released his wrist. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked away toward the tree line and did not look back. His men, those still able, followed him into the thornwood and disappeared into the dark. The weeks after were quiet in the way that things are quiet after a storm has moved on, not the absence of weather, but the settled feeling of ground that has been tested and held. Bram's shoulder healed. Skara changed his bandages without ceremony and with enough competence that he suspected she had tended wounds before. He thanked her once. She accepted it with a nod and went back to the forge work. The news from Milbrook came slowly, carried by travellers passing through on the road. Word had spread through the village that Draven had been turned away from the Tescan cottage. The story grew in the telling, as stories do. By the third week, Bram was said to have held off 8 men single-handed. By the fourth, Skara had supposedly broken a rifle in half with her bare hands. Neither of them corrected the story. The sheriff did not come to the valley. Letters arrived from Heartwall on official paper, asking questions about the Settlement Act and the lineage crystal. Whether the letters came from Draven or from the courts acting on old paperwork, Bram could not say. He answered them in his careful handwriting, referencing the bread and roof law and the sheriff's signed receipt of sale. The letters stopped. One evening in late winter, when the ice on the Tescan had begun to thin at the edges, Eldrick, the flour merchant, came to the cottage. He sat at the table with a cup of tea and his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, the way a man does when he is choosing his words. He had always been a careful man, the kind who counted coins twice and took his time before speaking, and he took his time now. He said, without looking at either of them directly, that some of the village families were wondering whether the blacksmith might be willing to come back to Milbrook on market days. "Skara too," Bram said. Aldrich looked at the table. "I think people have adjusted their views." "That's not what I asked." Aldrich looked up. He looked at Skara, who was standing by the hearth holding a cup of tea and saying nothing. "Yes," he said. "Her too." She looked at Bram. He looked at her. "We'll think about it," Bram said. After Aldrich left, they sat for a long time by the fire. The ice moved on the river outside. Somewhere in the thornwood, a night bird called. The question Aldrich had brought with him was still in the room, and neither of them was in a hurry to settle it. Some things deserved more than an evening. "You didn't say yes immediately," Skara said. "Wasn't my answer to give alone," he said. She turned the lineage crystal over in her fingers, catching the firelight. The purple stone glowed briefly, warm and deep. "My mother would have said the offer matters less than the reason it was made," she said. "Fear and convenience look like respect sometimes. They aren't the same thing." "Agreed," he said. But she would also have said that refusing every extended hand is its own kind of pride. He nodded. Outside, the wind moved through the ash trees. The fire crackled. They sat with the question between them like a tool not yet picked up, present and patient, waiting for the right moment and the right hands. Winter released the valley slowly, the way winter always does on the northern marches, grudgingly, in increments, one mild morning followed by 3 cold ones, until the mildness finally won. The ice on the Tescan broke in the 2nd week of March. Bram and Skara heard it from the forge, a long, slow sound, like something very old deciding to let go. They came out and stood on the bank and watched the plates of grey ice slide and separate and move downriver. It was Skara who suggested the fire. That evening, she cut 2 strips of birch bark. She set them on the table and handed Bram a piece of charcoal. She said nothing more. He understood. He wrote his wife's name on one strip, his son's on the other. His handwriting was deliberate, the way it gets when a person is trying to be careful with something that matters. Skara wrote her own names on a 3rd and 4th strip. She did not tell him the names, and he did not ask, but he could see there were several of them, small and close together on the bark. They built the fire outside, on the flat river stone behind the cottage. A proper fire, not large, but hot. They fed it pine resin first, then the bone-dry splits of oak she'd been setting aside for weeks without explaining why. At midnight, they stood on either side of the fire. Bram fed his strips in first. The bark caught quickly, flaring orange and white. The names disappeared in the flame. He stood and let himself feel what was there. The grief was not gone. He did not think it ever fully went. But it was different now, not a weight he was carrying alone in a cold house, but something acknowledged, witnessed, seen by another person who understood what it meant to lose the people who made you yourself. Skara fed her strips in after. She stood with her eyes closed and spoke quietly in her own language. The words had a rhythm that was not quite music and not quite prayer, but something that lived in the space between them. The fire moved and threw orange light across the snow still caught in the shadows between the ash trees. Then she was quiet. They stood on either side of the fire for a long time after. The river moved in the dark. The stars were out, hard and clear in the cold sky, the way they only get in deep winter on the frontier. After a while, Bram said, "I'm going to market in Milbrook next Thursday. If you want to come." "I'll think about it," she said. He accepted that. She reached across the fire and laid her palm flat on the stone beside his, not touching, just close. The stone was warm from the heat. Spring would come properly now. There would be work. The plough irons half the valley needed repaired. A bridge fitting in Hartwall, new tools to be traded for seeds and cloth. There would be more Thursdays and more markets and probably more difficulties, because the world did not change all at once. And not everyone in Milbrook had adjusted anything about their views. But the fire had burned, and the names had gone into it, and something had shifted, quietly, the way the ground shifts when winter finally concedes. The two of them had built something here out of iron and choice and time, and it had held under pressure, which is the only real test of anything made by hand. The fire burned low. The ash trees stood in the dark around the cottage, patient and silent. Bram and Skara stood by the warm stone and watched the last of the embers and did not need to say anything more.